Good morning. I'm going to bring up our slide deck and share with you. I'm glad we're back. I had a break getting down to see my folks in Oklahoma, so we're back again. We're studying First Kings, Melech Aleph, and we're in chapter 11, and this will be a pivotal chapter as we close out the Solomon cycle. And this is a sad chapter as we see the impact of Solomon's decisions with all that wisdom and with all of his gift and tremendous wealth that God has given him. It's going to be squandered. And we're going to see for the first time the division back to the 10 northern tribes of Israel and the southern tribe of Yehuda or Judah, and how these will carry on in the next phase of God's people and their development, the separated kingdoms of Israel and Judah. If we look at the slide deck, we're going to take one last time and see this amazing, as planned by God, as promised to Abraham, and then Moses, Joshua, coming in and conquering, and this wonderful united kingdom stretching from the Euphrates down to the Red Sea over to Egypt, and fulfilling the promise. And yet, in such a short amount of time, it will be destroyed. And so this is literally, for this cycle, the last time we'll see the United Kingdom of Israel, only until 1948, almost, 3,000 years since this time, would there be once again a truly united kingdom of Israel. And so it's a sad chapter. So let's get on to the next slide. Again, as we review, we can see some architectural renderings of the temple. Again, Zion, or the citadel of David, and the north of that, Solomon's great temple complex. Again, we are not exactly sure what the temple looked like, but it must have been magnificent, and certainly was at that time, a wonder of the world, as many people came to visit. A couple of weeks back, we talked about Bathsheba. I'm sorry, not Bathsheba, but the Queen of Sheba coming up, and that whole amazing connection between Israel at the time of Solomon and Ethiopia, and what is called South and Western Yemen. And of course, that is the tremendous source of frankincense and myrrh, and the great incense that are burned in virtually every temple and highly prized. Frankincense has certainly the aromatic value. It's also very important in healing. For the Egyptians, it was critical in embalming, and it is also a fumigant. And so flies, rats, gnats, mosquitoes, they don't like incense. They don't like the frankincense. And so it was so highly prized in the ancient world. And again, a modern look at the city of Yerushalayim. And you can see when you go there, the Western Wall, and that is the Temple Mount that the second temple was built under King Herod, and all of that great expansion. We've covered this a little bit more. I won't take much time. Again, that Temple Mount and Shlomo's, his the way he built up, especially the amazing walls around Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, and we have found them archaeologically, and it is truly amazing how that entire Temple Mount and complex was built, including his palace and his own palace. He had palace for the various special queens, like the daughter of Pharaoh, all separated out, housing their entire retinue. So it's not just the daughter of Pharaoh that comes, but all of her attendants and all of the court officials. And so It really is an amazing first-rate kingdom of its time and on par with anything in the world, and yet it will fade so quickly. And so we need to get into some of the concepts that this chapter presents. And this chapter gives us a very stark, almost for the first time. It's not that we don't pick up some of the hints of this in the Bible previous, but this is the first time where we really are confronted with the other gods of the people around Israel and the types of gods they worshiped. This really becomes the first time that we see the impact of idolatry or the worshiping of other gods affecting certainly God's people and God's relationship with the kingdom and with Solomon personally. And there's several that are mentioned in this chapter that we'll cover. I want to step back and talk a little bit about, so that we orient correctly, really what's going on in the world of Solomon at that time. Um, for forever, humans had worshipped in what they believe is a polytheistic way. In other words, um, I'm not sure what's going on here, but there's a God of the sky, there's a God of the waters, there's a God of the forests, many different gods. And of course, as the civilizations developed in the great city-states of Sumer and Akkad, and then eventually, not too long afterwards, along the Nile in Egypt, would emerge, people took natural cause and effect, and they attributed some sort of godlike quality to it. And it could be an aspect of nature, it could be an aspect of human experience, like love, hate, war, you name it. And they would personify that as a god, and they would worship that God. And it's very important for us to understand, and the reason why we're taking time in this class to introduce it, this will affect us through all of the rest of First and Second Kings, and even into the exile with protection not only of Persia, but the introduction of the Persian gods and what they worship, and then later, of course, the Greeks and the Romans. But the first idea is that people all through the Near East grew up in a particular locale. I am Abraham of Ur of the Chaldeans. I am of, I am from Ahashra or Asherah uh, of the Assyrians. Our God is Ashur. I am from Ur. My God is Enlo. I am from Babylon. My God is Marduk. I am from Tyre or Sidon. My God is Baal Molech. And so people believed that the geography was where the God existed. And so if you're coming into a different area, a different land, then you are into another sphere of influence of another God. This is very important, or gods. And so for Pharaoh to send his daughter to Solomon, not only does she come, but everything she's ever known, worshiping her gods, comes with her into Jerusalem. And so by Solomon having these various marital contracts, really alliances with other countries, it's not just that the wife or concubine comes into Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, but an entire retinue of people and priests and offerings and sacrifice occurs, because this is the gods that they know, and this is what the wife knows as she comes into Yerushalayim. In no way do I believe for 1 minute, and there's nothing to say that Pharaoh's daughter said, "Oh no, Solomon, you must not worship Yahweh." In fact, she would greatly respect, because after all, she's coming into Judea and Israel. But she would say, "But my God is." And this is very important to introduce the second point, which is henotheism. So we have polytheism, there are many gods. Henotheism says, yes, there may be other gods, but this is my God. And so this concept, we already have picked up in the scriptures. We're going to pick it up as we introduce the split kingdom And we certainly will introduce the great prophets Elijah and Elisha, Eliyahu and Elisha. Uh, and they will be fighting the fact that Israel, you have to choose who is your God. They're not necessarily saying there aren't other gods out there that the people are worshiping, but their call is no, you must worship your God, Yahweh. And so there is an interesting tension that we will pick up all through the narratives as we come into what we call, and what scholars call, the henotheistic phase of Israel. It's not that they've stopped worshiping Yahweh. It's not that Solomon is not having all of the temple practices going on at his incredible temple. It's that these other sites and shrines and imported gods with these wives are coming in alongside or near the temple at Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. And this is the crux of the problem. And Israel will be bedeviled by the fact that, well, I know I follow Yahweh, but I also, just to make sure, I also sacrifice to these other gods. Because after all, I'm living in a place that previously the Canaanites owned, and the Canaanites worship these other gods, or the Moabites, or whomever. And so polytheism, henotheism, and then finally, by the time we get to the great prophets, starting with Jeremiah and on to Isaiah, it will be very clear in the prophetic utterance there is only one God. There are no other gods. And this is a big mystery to biblical scholars. Why aren't those kind of emphatic statements made in, as an example, Exodus? In Exodus, it will say, "You shall have no other gods before me." And that is a henotheistic statement. And, excuse me, many people believe that, again, God works with people and he reveals his full nature at the right time. And he was very comfortable with Israel being spooked, being aware that there are the other people and they're worshiping these other gods. And it's almost as if God at that moment said, "Hey, you just worry about me." And in fact, some scholarship says this was really part of God's plan to test. Are you going to be faithful to me? Now, God knew there was no other gods, but it's almost like, are you going to really, really completely put faith in me? After all, the Egyptians have a lot of gods. The Hittites have a lot of gods. The Babylonians have a lot of gods. Are you going to stay faithful to me? By the time we get to the exile, God in his revealing with his prophets makes no bones about it. There are no other gods. There is only the one Lord God, and let's not waste any time. And so, very important you see that, so that there's no confusion in the scriptures. The message is the same. It's how God allows his people to be revealed of the truth. And so I want to take a little bit of time to do the explaining polytheism, henotheism, and then finally, of course, monotheism, the one and only true living God. We are going to be introduced in chapter 11 to especially three gods that will plague Israel and Judah. The first is Ashtaroth, and here is the slide I presented. The name Ashtaroth was derived from the Phoenician goddess Astarte, and the equivalent of the Babylonian Ishtar. And it really comes back to a much earlier Sumerian name for the goddess Inanna, or Ashtaroth Inanna, or Ashtaroth Ishtar. And she is associated with love, beauty, sex, war, justice, political power, all kinds of very passionate things, and of course fertility. She was originally worshipped in Sumer under the name Inanna, as I mentioned, and was later worshipped by the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and Assyrians under Ishtar. She was known as the Queen of Heaven and was the patron goddess of the Anan temple at Uruk. Vast temple, amazing, they've dug up, which was her main cult center. She's associated with the planet Venus. This is very important because many people believe the same concept of this goddess with these attributes was simply picked up by the Greeks, because the Greeks are very close to the Phoenicians, and then they bring it in and they give they give her a new name, Venus or Aphrodite in Greek, and then Venus in Latin. And so very much a very powerful, particularly when it comes to fertility. And you will hear in our scriptures over and over again, the cutting down of the Ashtaroth pole. And this is what we're talking about. And so it's I'm struggling up here in Naphtali. I believe in Yahweh. I try to do the right thing, but oh boy, there's my crop. So I better put up an Ashtaroth pole and pray for fertility. The second god that's mentioned is very specific with Moab or the Moabites. David's lineage comes from root from the Moabites, and not only in your scriptures are mentioned about the Moabite god Shamash, but we have great archaeological record of that. In fact, they found a stele, a stone announcement, if you will, that describes a passage out of 2 Kings 23:13. And this is an incident where basically Edom, who had been under the control of the United Kingdom, rebels against both Judah and Israel and regains its independence. And it's called the Mesha stone. Again, it's one of the archaeological jewels that we have. And it says, and Shemash, their god, drove him out before them. In other words, he pushed off the yoke of the kingdom of Judah and Israel from the Edomites. And literally, they were independent from then on. And so that is the god mentioned, and clearly at Solomon's court, wives, I would assume, from Moab are coming in, and they also are bringing in their cultic gods. And finally, and probably the most disturbing, good old Moloch or Baal Molech. Later, he will be called Baal Melkor up at Tyre and Sidon. And this is the Canaanite god Moloch, as mentioned many times in the Bible. All of these texts condemn the Israelites who ever engage in this practice associated with Moloch. And it's associated with the sacrifice of children. I think if you're in the class cycle, and I was talking about the conquest, and why did God sanction a complete annihilation of the Canaanitic peoples in the land of Israel, the promised land? One of the things I ask us to consider is that the people were steeped in this kind of practice, this horrendous sacrificing of children to their various gods, Molech being the most pronounced. And the activity of causing children to pass over the fire, as described in the scriptures, is literally a statue with the hands out, a bull figure, and of course the hands just blazing hot, glowing red or even white, and the child placed in the hands, and of course just immediately burned to death, and just so horrible. It's unthinkable. And so this reflex is picked up many times in the scriptures in Deuteronomy, 2 Kings, on down to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, where it just says, you can have nothing to do with this. This is just such an abomination to God, to take innocent children and to sacrifice them. And so these types of influences are being brought to Yerushalayim, right next to the temple, under Solomon's political ambitions, with his many marriages, his many alliances through obviously marriage and concubinage, and they're coming into Yerushalayim, and they're setting up their little cults, because that's what they worshiped wherever they were, and now they're coming in, as you could think of it as an ambassadorial envoy or whatever. But we're going to set up our shop, and we're going to do what we do when we worship our God. And so it's a mess. We're going to stop there, and we're going to go over to the narrative so we don't get too far. We'll come back to the slide deck. Here we go with the narrative. It says in 1 Kings 11, King Solomon loved many foreign women besides the daughter of Pharaoh. There were women from Moab, or Moabi, Ammoni, Edomi, Zidoni, and the Hittite, nations about whom Adonai had said to the people of Israel, "You're not going to go among them, or they among you, because they will turn your hearts towards their gods." And we'll stop there with a pause. And Mike or Matt or whoever is facilitating the class, great time to just talk about what does it mean to turn your heart away from God? Well, did Solomon not have enough? Did he not have enough wisdom and power and money and prestige? And yet his heart is turned away. So let's take a few minutes and talk about that. And we're back again. And right there in the narrative, it tells us that Solomon was deeply attached to them by his love. Okay, deeply attached to them by his love. I don't think that was just, courtly love or knightly love, or I think he had a problem. He had 700 wives, all princesses, 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. Good heavens, how could you even, do the math? You may see one once every 3 years. If you visited everyone at least a little moment. I mean, this is just ridiculous. But they turned his heart away. For when Solomon became old, not while he was young, when he became old, his wives turned his heart away towards other gods. See, I don't think his mind was so sharp. I don't think they would have ever turned him away from God mentally, but it's his heart. So that he was not wholehearted with Adonai his God as David his father had been. For Solomon he followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidoni, Melkomen, the abomination of the Ammoni. Thus Solomon did what was evil in Adonai's view and did not fully follow Adonai as his father had done. Solomon built a high place for, here we go, this is hard to read. Solomon built a high place for Chemosh. That's what we were talking about, Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill in front of Yerushalayim. And another for Molech, here we go, the abomination of the people of Ammon. This is what he did for all his foreign wives, who then offered a sacrifice to their gods. And so everything that tells us archaeologically and in the written text and everything is that he let that horrific child sacrifice occur at the Temple Mount, right next to the temple of Yahweh. And God must have just been, weeping with that. It's not just a mistake; it is a horrendous abdication of everything, even morally or ethically, that is right. The sacrifice of children on the Temple Mount. Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill in front of Yerushalayim, and another for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. This is what he did for all his foreign wives, who then offered and sacrificed to their gods. So there's this grotesque cacophony of little cults and high places and little altars and sacrifices all around this beautiful, gorgeous temple to Yahweh. I don't know how the people did it. I mean, it's hard to read. It's hard to get your head around. So Adonai grew angry, no kidding, with Solomon, because his heart had turned away from Adonai, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and given him orders concerning this matter, that he should not follow other gods. But he did not obey Adonai's orders. So Adonai said to Solomon, "Since this is what you have in your mind, and you have not kept my covenant and my regulations, which I ordered you to obey, I will tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. However, for David, your father's sake, I will not do this while you're alive, but I will tear it away from your son. Even then, I will not tear away all the kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Yerushalayim." Jerusalem, for which I have chosen. And so God's pronouncement on Solomon is very harsh. You're going to lose the kingdom. Saul lost his kingdom for far less than this, far less than this. And so Solomon is about to lose a big chunk of his kingdom. His son will continue to have the kingdom of Yehuda or Judah, but the greater part of Israel will be gone. Then Adonai raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomi, of the royal line of Edom. Back when David had been in Edom, and Joab, the commander of the army, had gone up to bury the dead, having killed every male in Edom. Wow, that's brutal. For Joab and all Israel had stayed there 6 months until he had eliminated every male in Edom. Yet David was a man of blood. There's no doubt about it. Hadad had fled, he and a number of Edomi servants of his father with him, and gone into Egypt. This is very interesting. Egypt's going to become this not so friendly place for the kingdom of Israel. And so this first interloper against Solomon, an Edomite, flees to Egypt. At the time, Hadad had been a small boy, but on their way, they passed through Midian and arrived in Paran and took with them men from Paran and went into Egypt to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. That's interesting. Wait a minute. Isn't this the Pharaoh that gave Solomon his daughter? Actually, no. That Pharaoh is now died. This is a different Pharaoh, and he's got a different attitude towards Solomon and this upstart kingdom north of him. He gave Hadad a house, saw to it that he had food, and gave him land. Hadad became a great favorite of Pharaoh. That's interesting, a great favor of Pharaoh, so that he gave him his own wife's sister in marriage, that is, the sister Tachpeneses, the queen. The sister of Tachpeneses bore him Genovat, his son, and Tachpeneses brought him up in Pharaoh's own house, so that Genovat was in Pharaoh's house along with Pharaoh's sons. And this is the first time we start getting ever in the scriptures an actual name for which Pharaoh we're talking about. And we know because of this name, we can tie that back to which Pharaoh. When Hadad in Egypt heard that David slept with his ancestors and Joab, the commander of the army, was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me leave so I can return to my own country." Pharaoh asked him, "What you have, what? But what? You have lacked with me that makes you want just now to go to your own country?" "Nothing in particular," he replied, "but let me leave anyway." And so the first adversary during Solomon's reign that will be raised up is actually raised ahead of even Solomon taking over his kingdom. And so God in his wisdom knew that Solomon's heart would be turned, and so he's raising up these adversaries that are going to inflict upon him this kind of trouble. And again, it's God disciplining. Then God raised up another adversary against Solomon, Rezon, son of Eliad, who had fled from his lord, Hadazir, king of Tov. When David killed the men from Tov, Rezon rallied men to himself and became the leader of a band of marauders. They went to Damnasek, that's Damascus, and settled there. While he became a king of Damnasek, he remained an adversary as long as Solomon lived, causing difficulties in addition to those of Hadad. He detested Israel and ruled Aram. This tells you right here, late in Solomon's kingdom, he loses all of that territory that David had conquered up through Syria. Also, Yehoram, son of Nebat, Ephrati from Zerdah, his mother was Atzorah, one of Solomon's servants, rebelled against the kingdom. Here is the reason he rebelled against the king. Solomon was building the Milo and closing the breach in it, the wall of the city of David his father. Now this Yorav was strong and energetic man, and Solomon, seeing how serious the young man was, made him supervisor over all the work being done by the tribe of Joseph. Once during this period, Yehoram had gone out of Yerushalayim, and the prophet Achiah from Shiloh spotted him traveling. Achiah was wearing a new cloak, and the two of them were alone in the open country. Achiah took hold of the new cloak that he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Yerovam, Take 10 pieces for yourself, for here is what Adonai, the God of Israel, says: I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand, and I will give 10 tribes to you, but will keep one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Yerushalayim, the city I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel. I will do this because they've abandoned me and worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess of Sidoni, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Melkomen, the god of the Ammonites, or Molech. And so let's stop there. So even as Solomon, in his aged end of his reign, really blows it big, already God has set in motion these people who will upset his kingdom. And this shows the sovereignty of God. God knew the direction Solomon would go. And so even years before Solomon even starts his reign, here God is raising up these people who, in essence, will rebel and will pull off the discipline that God will inflict on Solomon and the separating of the kingdom. And of course, this is in English, this is Jeroboam, and we will, in the next chapter, learn of Solomon's son, Rehoboam, that will take the remaining tribe. As it turns out, the Benjamini will come in with Judah, and it will be the two tribes. But I want to go back to the slide deck and look at a couple of more issues. We looked at the different gods, and then now let's get into some good archaeology. We're going to introduce, as we close out the narrative in the class, we're going to be introduced to a guy named Shishak, or in Egyptian, Shoshank, or really hard K, so Shoshank the first. And this is the first Egyptian king, the first pharaoh that is mentioned in the Bible. Whatever pharaoh that Abraham met, we don't know. The pharaoh of Joseph and the family going into Egypt, we don't know. The pharaoh of Moses, we don't know. But we do know the pharaoh that's going to play such a dramatic part as this kingdom of Israel and Judah splits. And so he's the first named in the Bible, 1 Kings 11 and 14. Solomon collaborated with Pharaoh Shamu. And we know that this is the Pharaoh before Shoshank. And we know that that is the Pharaoh that gave his daughter to Solomon. By the way, very weak, a very, very, very weak Pharaoh, which explains why he gave his daughter to Solomon. Solomon then reinforced Gezer with strong double walls and his 6-chambered gates, as he also did at Megiddo, Hatzor, and Jerusalem. He also does that at Beersheba. And we'll get into the archaeology next week. Jeroboam fled from Solomon to Shishak in Egypt, 1 Kings 11, who welcomed him and gave his wife's sister to Mary. When Solomon died in 930 BC, Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead, and Jeroboam returned to Shechem the same year and became the king of the northern tribes of Israel. In 925, Shishak invaded Canaan and took away the treasures of Jerusalem, including all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. There's an interesting, literally balance of gold weight accounts that I'll bring up next week about how much gold is mentioned by your scriptures in the time and at the closing of Solomon, and how much gold was taken, literally ascribed on the memorial of Shishak out of Israel, and it's precise. It's just phenomenal. Here's the cartouche of Shishak or Shoshank, and then here is part of the Great Wall of the Temple of Karnak celebrating his reign, and very archaeologically sound and secure, and we know who he is. And sure enough, it shows him in that classic, a pharaonic relief, conquering the people of Israel and Judah, and it's right there. And so we will pick that up next week as we explore a very important historical moment in our scriptures, and that is the campaign of Shishak into Israel and the taking of the great treasury that Solomon had built up. And we'll close out the narrative and be done for today. And it's very sad. We'll finish out a sad chapter. And so God says, they have not lived according to my ways so that they could do what was right in my view and obey my regulations. Rulings, as David my father did. Nevertheless, I will not take this entire kingdom away from him, but I will make him prince as long as he lives, for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose, because he obeyed my mitzvahs and regulations. However, I will take the kingdom away from his son and give 10 tribes of it to you. And so this is God literally through the prophet talking to Jeroboam. To his son I will give 1 tribe, so that David my servant will always have a light burning before me in Yerushalayim, the city I chose for myself as the place to put my name. I will take you, and you will rule over everything you want. You will be king over Israel. Now, if you will listen to all that I order you and live according to my ways and do what is right in my view, so that you observe my regulations and mitzvahs, as David, my servant, did, then I will be with you, and I will build you a lasting dynasty, as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. For this offense, I will trouble David's descendants, but not forever. Because of this, Solomon tried to kill. Okay, so this prophecy that's going to Jeroboam, Solomon hears about, and he tries to kill Jeroboam or Jeroboam. But when Jeroboam roused himself, he fled to Egypt. Where does he go? To Shishak, king of Egypt. And he stayed in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Other activities of Solomon, all he accomplished, his wisdom, are recorded in the annals of Solomon. The length of Solomon's reign in Yerushalayim of all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David with his father, and Rechavim, or Rehoboam, as we say in English, his son became king in his place. And so we close out a very, very sad chapter in the history of God's people. This will be it for the United Kingdom. We'll have many more adventures coming up, and a good time here to close and let Mike or Matt really talk about what kind of impact does it have on people and countries and nations when you simply do not follow God and you're led down a compromised way, a compromised position. You do things half-heartedly. You try to cut the edges and do things that are not what they should be. And this is a great place to close out. Thank you very much.